Hello, I'm Jen, and this is Literary Love 123. If you're new here, welcome. If you are returning, thank you for coming back. So, in my part of the world today, as well as in other parts too, there is an eclipse that will be taking place. So, when an eclipse occurs, my thoughts naturally turn to women who their abusive husbands. In today's video, we will be talking about Stephen King's Gerald's Game and Dolores Claiborne, and talking about how each of these novels represent women who eclipse the patriarchy and effectively get rid of their abusive spouses. Let's get into it. Like the previous Carrie video that I uploaded, today's video contains portions of my thesis, which is titled Eclipsing the Patriarchy, the Power of Intergenerational Female Connection in Stephen King's It, Carrie, Gerald's Game, and Dolores Claiborne. So I will be including in the description box a list of references that I used for my thesis and for this video. These are my copies of Dolores Claiborne and Gerald's Game. I literally split my copy of Gerald's Game in half when I was annotating it for my thesis. It's held together by tape here. So this is a very well-worn, very loved edition of Gerald's Game. With all of that being discussed, let's get right into the portion of my thesis where I talk about Dolores and Jessie. Trigger and content warnings for this video include violence, SA, parental abuse, blood, and death. There may be more, but those are the ones that I can name off the top of my head. So now that you have time to step away if you need to, let's go ahead and get into this discussion of Dolores Claiborne and Jessie Burlingame. So I'm going to be reading from my thesis. So some of the quotes that I have from other sources may sound a little clunky. So I apologize for that, but I want to make sure that even when I'm speaking, that I'm giving credit to original thoughts from other people. So let's get started. Written in the early 1990s, Gerald's Game reflects the changing perceptions of domestic abuse, especially considered against the backdrop of the findings and criticisms of the feminist movement during the 1960s and 70s. This is a quote from Canfield. In this novel, King, another quote from Canfield here, King examines larger societal issues such as abuse and anti-feminism, end quote, through the character and experiences of female protagonist Jessie Burlingame. Molested by her father when she was 10 and a half, Jessie represses these memories until her husband behaves in a similarly abusive manner, thereby forcing Jessie to confront both her past and present abuse. When Jessie's husband Gerald handcuffs her to a bed in their remote cabin and then refuses to remove the cuffs when she asks him to do so, Jessie kicks him in an attempt to stop him from raping her. As a result of being kicked, Gerald falls off the bed and dies of a heart attack. Still handcuffed to the bed, Jessie must fight to break free from both the handcuffs and the trauma that has overshadowed her since the day of the eclipse during which her father molested her. After Gerald's death, Jessie begins to uncover repressed memories of abuse. Through a combination of internal voices and personas, Jessie confronts the long-lasting trauma that resulted from being molested by her father during that fateful eclipse. The first inkling of Jessie's past trauma begins when Gerald refuses to move the handcuffs, thereby putting Jessie in a vulnerable situation that reminds her of the helplessness she felt when she was molested by her father. The sensation of Gerald's spit falling onto her stomach disgusts Jessie and evokes memories of a similar traumatic experience from her past. King writes, "The runner of drool fell off Gerald's chin. It dangled for a moment, elongating, and then fell on her midriff just above the navel. Something about this sensation was familiar, and she was swept by a horrible, intense sensation of déjà vu. The room seemed to darken around her, as if the windows and skylight had been replaced with panes of smoked glass. Page 34 of my copy of Gerald's Game. Jessie's memory of her father's semen on her skin is triggered when Gerald's saliva drips onto her abdomen. She sees drool, but she thinks spunk. In this moment, Jessie recovers a memory of her father during the day of the eclipse, recalling, quote, the hard thing pressed against her buttock, spasming, and some liquid was spreading there, soaking a hot spot through her pants, end quote. That's from Gerald's Game, page 219. Although this incident sharpens Jessie's memory of her father's molestation, it is evident that these memories have been lurking within Jessie's unconscious throughout her lifetime. She realized that over the years since the abuse occurred, she has, quote, dreamed about the smoked glass, about how the sun went out, about the flat and tearful smell that was like minerals in well water, about his hands, end quote. With this epiphany, Jessie finally sees how her life choices have been influenced, quote, by what had happened during the final moment or so she had spent on her daddy's lap, looking at a vast round mole in the sky through 2 or 3 pieces of smoked glass. This epiphany leads Jessie to ask herself, when you finally kicked out, who were you kicking at? Was it Gerald? End quote. Thus, by finally coming to terms with her past, Jessie is able to break free from the hold both her father and Gerald have had on her. In addition to freeing herself from the mental and emotional grip of her oppressors, Jessie also escapes the literal bondage of the handcuffs Gerald placed on her. In order to free herself, Jessie uses a shard of glass to pierce her wrist, thus mirroring the pain of confronting the past in order to free herself from it. Initially, the blood comes out slowly. However, once Jessie severs a bundle of her veins, it eventually begins to flow, quote, like water from a tap which has been spun almost all the way open, end quote. Yet, even with the increased blood flow, Jessie realizes that this act alone will not be enough to free her from the cuffs. Thus, she makes a brutal but necessary life-saving decision. Although Jessie does not know about the medical term degloving, she nevertheless performs this procedure on herself once she understands that she, quote, cannot depend on the blood alone to slide her free, end quote. King writes, just as Jessie was about to relax her aching arm, the cuff slid over the small protrusion which had held it for so long, flew off the ends of her fingers, and clacked against the bedpost. It all happened so fast that Jessie was at first unable to grasp that it had happened. Her hand no longer looked like the sort of equipment normally issued to human beings, but it was her hand, and it was free. End quote. The blood literally saves Jessie's life, as her degloving allows her to break free from her handcuffs. At this point, she is also figuratively set free as she finally confronts her traumatic past with her father and her present with Gerald, and starts to come to terms with all of it. She finds life, healing, and strength because she finally allows herself to acknowledge and experience the pain she has dealt with as a result of abuse. This visceral scene is, a quote from Julia Kristeva, the sublime point at which the abject collapses in a burst of beauty that overwhelms us, end quote. Jessie has been, quote, confined to the narrow room in which she's been given a deadly brainwashing, end quote, from Helene Cixous. She's been giving this deadly brainwashing both in the memories of her father and in her current situation of being literally handcuffed to a bedpost by her husband. Nevertheless, as Jessie breaks free from the handcuffs, she demonstrates that, as Cixous continues, women can be incarcerated, slowed down, but for a time only. Jessie's days of incarceration at the hands of men are over as she emerges from the battle a free woman. After freeing herself from the cuffs, as Jessie gulps water from the sink, she smells, quote, the bland mineral smell which had haunted her over all the years since her father had molested her during the eclipse. But now it was all right. Now it was not the smell of fear and shame, but of life. End quote. This one gets me. Hence, Jessie is once again willing to face the pain of opening wounds in order to heal them, as Christopher writes. The abject shatters the wall of repression and its judgments. It is an alchemy that transforms the death drive into a start of life of new significance. End quote. After Jessie escapes death, she emerges to embrace a new life, evident when she says, out of my way, Gerald, and then kicks his dead body out of her path. When Jessie frees herself from the handcuffs and the looming shadows of both Gerald's and her father's abuse, she also frees herself from misplaced guilt and internalized misogyny that has been building within her ever since she was molested by her father. After molesting Jessie, her father makes excuses for his actions by telling Jessie that her mother, quote, hasn't been very affectionate lately, and a man has certain needs, end quote. Jessie's father also gaslights Jessie into believing that her mother will blame her if she finds out about the molestation, thereby blackmailing Jessie into silence. Hearing her father blame her mother for his abuse and then believing her mother will blame her if she discovers what took place, preteen Jessie internalizes these misogynistic beliefs, and as a result, she blames herself for her father's sexually abusive behavior towards her. Like Beverly in King's It, preteen Jessie fears womanhood as a result of her father's abuse. After being molested by her father, Jessie thinks, quote, I never want boobs and curvy hips. If they make things like this happen, who would? End quote. Yet, despite blaming herself for her father's actions, there is nevertheless a part of Jessie that knows her father is responsible for his actions. Even as a child, Jessie realizes her father, quote, was the grown-up. He was the one who had left that funny-smelling crud on the back of her underpants. He was the one who was supposed to be ashamed, end quote. Finally, after confronting her past trauma after Gerald's death, adult Jessie completely understands that her father, quote, manipulated her. First the apology, then the tears, and finally the hat trick, turning his problem into her problem, end quote. At the same time, Jessie also realizes that Gerald, too, has been manipulating and using her. King writes, quote, for Gerald, Jessie Mahat Burlingame was really not here at all. She had ceased to be here when the keys made their small, steely clicks in the locks of the handcuffs, end quote. At this point, Gerald views his wife Jessie as an object that merely exists for his pleasure. The level of Gerald's objectification of Jessie is alarmingly evident when he refuses to remove the handcuffs at her request, thereby attempting to force her into a non-consensual sex act. Jessie realizes, quote, Gerald knew she wasn't kidding about not wanting to go on with it. He knew, but he had chosen not to know he knew, end quote. Thus, Gerald's actions reflect Beauvoir's argument that men use force to make women shoulder the consequences of their reluctant submission, end quote. Jessie's reluctant resignation to silently submit to Gerald's abuse is revealed through the words of good wife Burlingame, who internally speaks to Jessie, saying, let him do it then. Just let him do it, and it will be done, end quote. Goodwife Burlingame is the personification of Jessie's internalized misogyny. Throughout Jessie's lifetime, the good wife is, quote, often the voice of blame and almost always the voice of denial, end quote. Goodwife Burlingame reinforces Beauvoir's claim that women are taught to accept masculine authority and forego criticizing, examining, and judging for themselves, end quote. Countering the voice of Goodwife Burlingame is the voice of Jessie's strong feminist college roommate, Ruth Neary. Jessie hears, in quotes, Ruth say, "If he's dead, it's his own damned fault." Ruth helps Jessie, according to Cixous, kill the false woman who is preventing the live one from breathing, end quote. Eventually, Ruth's voice starts to overpower Goodwife Burlingame's. For example, when the voice of Goodwife Burlingame accuses Jessie of murdering Gerald, Jessie says aloud in Ruth's voice, "Bullshit." After leaving the cabin, Jessie continues her journey of healing, stating, "I'm going to be okay. Not today, not tomorrow, and not next week, but eventually. Survival is still an option, and sometimes it even feels good. Sometimes it feels like victory," end quote. By allowing painful memories of the past to resurface, Jessie, quote, bears witness to a litany of horrors, quote from Siodmak and Scannell. In doing so, Jessie not only confronts her own trauma, but also the trauma experienced by both Carrie White and Dolores Claiborne. In a vision, Jessie sees her preteen self, known by the pet name Pumpkin, or Punkin, as her father says it. She sees her preteen self in the stocks with the words "for sexual enticement" nailed above her, while also simultaneously envisioning beside her younger self another girl in stocks who is described as perhaps 17 and fat with a complexion blotched with pimples, end quote. In the novel Carrie, King describes teenage Carrie White as, quote, a chunky girl with pimples on her neck and back and buttocks, end quote. Thus, the description of the other girl in Jessie's vision fits the description of Carrie White. Further evidence suggests that this other girl is Carrie. King writes, Jessie could now see the other girl as well, the fat one with the pimply skin. The fat girl hadn't been as lucky as Punkin. There had been no escape for her, unless death itself was an escape in certain cases, a hypothesis Jessie has become quite willing to accept, end quote. Yet, despite the bleak circumstances Jessie finds herself enduring, she is determined to keep fighting, telling herself that she does not want to end up like the other girl in her vision. Jessie hears the voice of Punkin willing her to confront the truth so she can finally break free from both her present situation and her past trauma. Additionally, Jessie is also connected to Dolores Claiborne through shared trauma at the hands of abusive fathers and husbands, and through their mutual visions of one another during the eclipse. During the eclipse, Jessie sees Dolores also, quote, in the path of the eclipse and on her knees too, end quote. In Jessie's vision, she also sees Dolores make her husband Joe fall down the well. In order to free themselves and others from patriarchal oppression, both Jessie and Dolores embrace the power of the bitch. Jessie escapes her abuse through the empowering voices of Ruth and Punkin, who, quote, could certainly be a bitch when she set her mind to it, end quote. Becoming a bitch is how Jessie survives her ordeal in the cabin, as Dolores Claiborne so eloquently states. In the end, it's the bitches of the world who abide. And that is from Dolores Claiborne on page 312 in my edition. Now let's talk about Dolores. Dolores Claiborne's, quote, publication date coincides with increased levels of reported domestic abuse, as well as the nation's growing counterattack against feminism. This is a quote from Canfield. In Dolores Claiborne, King's portrayal of the abused wife, Dolores, quote, gave domestic abuse a face by acknowledging the pervasiveness of domestic violence and provided a social critique because it illustrates how few options women possess when they confront domestic violence. Quote from Canfield. Although the abuse Dolores endured at the hands of her husband was well known to the community, no one intervened, including the police, because of their belief that the home was private, and what men do specifically in the home is no one's business. Once Dolores fights back against Joe's abuse, he shifts his focus to their daughter, Selena. Like both Beverly Marsh's and Jessie Burlingame's fathers, Dolores' husband Joe sexually abuses his daughter, Selena. As Canfield writes, Joe's focus on his daughter quickly turned not only violent but also sexual. End quote. Thus, Dolores' only chance to free her children and herself from Joe's abuse is to take matters into her own hands. Dolores cannot depend on the police force or her neighbors to help protect her or her children from Joe's abuse. Even before killing Joe in order to protect herself and her children and end the cycle of abuse, Dolores has already established a pattern of doing whatever is necessary to provide for her children. She takes on the masculine role of financially providing for her family, thereby demonstrating Butler's argument that, quote, gender identity is a performative accomplishment compelled by social sanction and taboo, and as such, in its very character as performative resides the possibility of contesting its reified status, end quote. At best, Joe is a weight that Dolores must carry, as she explains, quote, Joe St. George really want a man at all. He was a goddamn millstone I wore around my neck, end quote. Like the Shining's Wendy, Dolores is, quote, the sole stabilizing force of the family, dealing with a husband who is a burden to bear, sometimes literally. This is a quote from Rethinking the Old Ball and Chain, and that is going to be cited in my reference section. Dolores in her marriage and in patriarchal society at large is, quote, integrated into the group governed by males where she occupies a subordinate position, end quote from Beauvoir. For example, although Dolores' name is on her children's savings account, Joe is able to take the money without her signature, thereby leaving Dolores without access to the funds. Thus, she and her children remain trapped in an abusive environment with no financial means with which to escape. When Dolores questions the banker about how Joe was able to take the money without her consent, she is told that the process is perfectly legal and that it is standard bank practice. Yet if the situation were reversed and Dolores had tried to access money without Joe's consent, she knows that his consent would have been required. The patriarchal society in which Dolores exists infiltrates institutions such as the bank. Because of the overarching nature of patriarchy, Joe is viewed as, quote, the man of the house and in charge, while Dolores is viewed as the little woman, and all she was in charge of was baseboards, toilet bowls, and chicken dinners on Sunday afternoons, end quote. Legally speaking, Dolores has no recourse with which she can fight back against Joe. Thus, in order to free herself and her children from his abuse, Dolores must operate outside the legal system. Feeling desperate, Dolores shares her burden with her wealthy employer, Vera Donovan. This sets in motion the fateful events that take place during the upcoming eclipse. Dolores explains to Vera that her husband has taken the money from the children's savings account and that he is trying to, quote, screw his own daughter, end quote. Because Dolores lacks financial means for her and her children to escape Joe's abuse, she can see no way out of her situation. However, Vera offers Dolores a solution to her problem by suggesting that Dolores orchestrate an accident that will claim the life of her abusive husband. As Vera explains, quote, an accident is sometimes an unhappy woman's best friend, end quote. Empowered by Vera's words, Dolores makes a conscious decision to do whatever it takes to ensure that Joe can no longer harm her or their children. She embraces the mantra that Vera so aptly communicates, quote, sometimes you have to be a high-riding bitch to survive. Sometimes being a bitch is all a woman has to hold on to. With Vera's words in mind, Dolores lays out her plan for Joe's accident to take place on the day of the eclipse. When the day of the eclipse arrives, Dolores begins to set her plans in motion. When doing so, she catches a vision of young Jessie from Gerald's game, who, like Dolores' daughter Selena, is a victim of her father's sexual abuse. While making her confession to the authorities, Dolores recalls seeing a young girl whose, quote, daddy's hand was on her leg way up high, higher than it ought to have been, maybe, end quote. Unlike Selena, Jessie cannot depend on her mother to rescue her from her father's abuse. Dolores sees the danger Jessie faces when left alone with her father, while Jessie's own mother either does not see or perhaps pretends not to see the threat her husband poses to their daughter. Furthermore, Dolores is willing to do what Jessie's mother will not do: protect her children at all cost. Through shared trauma and visions, Dolores and Jessie are connected in their fight against patriarchal oppression. Even years later, their connection is still strong, as Dolores senses when adult Jessie is in trouble in the cabin, stating, quote, I thought of how it had crossed my mind that the woman she'd grown into was in trouble. I wondered how she was and where she was, but I never once wondered if she was. If you see what I mean. I knew she was, is. I have never doubted it. End quote. Although their cries for help are silenced or ignored by the institutions and people who should have protected them, Dolores and Jessie nevertheless create their own shared system of female empowerment, thereby triumphing over patriarchal oppression and breaking abusive cycles. Once Dolores kills Joe, she is, quote, certain that her daughter is safe and Joe can no longer be an influence to her sons, end quote. That's from Ruta Canyon. Looked at in this way, Dolores ends not only the cycle of abuse in her present family, but also takes steps to reduce the likelihood that the cycle of abuse will be passed down to future generations of her family. As Dolores states, quote, everything I did for love. There's no bitch on earth like a mother frightened for her kids, end quote. Thus, Dolores' love for her children propels her to act during the eclipse so that she can ensure a more hopeful future for each of them, her daughter in particular. It is quite fitting that Dolores' daughter is named Selena. This name derives from the word Selos, meaning bright, and it is related to Selene, the name of the Greek goddess of the moon. In King's novel, because of Dolores' courageous actions, her daughter Selena is rescued from an abusive father and as such represents hope for a brighter future. That is the end of my sections on Jessie and Dolores. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you like this kind of video, please let me know down in the comments below. Thank you for watching this. I appreciate it if you would hit that like button, subscribe, hit that bell so you won't miss a video from me. Thank you.